Welcome to the True Crime Case Study. Today we will dive into the unexpected and tough story about Father Marcus and his two parishioners. The father turned out to be not what he seemed. Father Marcus was a man who commanded respect in the small town where he had served as a priest for over 2 decades. At 52 years old, he had seen the community grow, change, and evolve, and he was often credited with being the steady hand that guided the town through difficult times. With his tall, imposing stature and calm, reassuring voice, he embodied the figure of a spiritual leader. His sermons were powerful, filled with wisdom, and he had a unique ability to connect with people from all walks of life. To many, Father Marcus was more than just a priest. He was a beacon of hope and a symbol of unwavering moral strength. Yet, beneath the surface of his public persona, Father Marcus harbored secrets. The man who preached kindness and understanding to his parishioners was far less gentle at home. His marriage to Darla, a 48-year-old woman who had once been full of life and joy, had grown strained over the years. They had met when they were young, and their early years together were marked by love and mutual respect. But as the years went by, Marcus's dedication to the church began to overshadow everything else in his life, including his marriage. Darla had always been a supportive wife, standing by Marcus as he rose through the ranks of the church. She had her own ambitions and dreams, but she set them aside to support her husband's calling. As the years passed, the tension between them escalated. Marcus became more authoritarian at home, often criticizing Darla for small things and demanding that she fulfill her duties as a priest's wife without complaint. He expected her to be the perfect hostess during church events, to maintain the household impeccably, and to never question his authority. Darla, who had once been a vibrant and independent woman, found herself trapped in a life that felt increasingly suffocating. There were times when Darla thought about leaving, but the fear of being alone and the social stigma of abandoning her husband, a respected priest, kept her from taking that step. The small town was deeply conservative, and a woman leaving her husband, especially a man like Father Marcus, would have been scandalous. So she stayed, enduring the coldness, the loneliness, and the quiet despair that had become her daily existence. The stage was set for a tragedy that would soon unfold, one that would reveal the darkness lurking behind the respectable facade of Father Marcus. Now we meet with key character of this story. Linda Matthews, a 35-year-old woman, had once known happiness. She had been married to the love of her life, a soldier named Daniel, who had been everything to her: husband, best friend, and protector. Their love story had been one for the ages, filled with moments of pure joy and deep connection. But war had a way of tearing apart even the most beautiful things, and when Daniel died on the mission, Linda's world shattered. Linda's younger sister, Carol, had always looked up to her. At 29, Carol was full of life, with a spirit as bright as Linda's had once been. But seeing her sister in such despair broke Carol's heart. She had always been the one who leaned on Linda for support, but now the roles were reversed. Carol knew she had to be strong for Linda, to help her find a way out of the darkness that had enveloped her life. The church, a place Carol had always found comfort in, seemed like the last hope. Carol had never been particularly religious, but the church had always been a sanctuary, a place where she could find peace and reflect. She believed that perhaps, through prayer and spiritual guidance, Linda might find some solace too. So she began gently urging Linda to attend services with her. At first, Linda resisted. The idea of finding comfort in anything seemed impossible, but Carol was persistent, and slowly Linda began to agree. It started with Sunday services, where Linda would sit quietly in the back, listening to the hymns and sermons, but not really engaging. The pain was still too raw, the wound too fresh. But over time, something began to shift. The church, with its quiet sanctity and the steady, calming presence of Father Marcus, started to have an effect. Carol noticed the change in Linda, subtle at first, but unmistakable. The church was becoming a place where Linda could let go of her grief, if only for a little while. Father Marcus's sermons, filled with messages of hope, redemption, and the eternal nature of love, seemed to resonate with her. He often spoke of the trials and tribulations of life and how faith could help one navigate through even the darkest of times. Linda began to see in him a guide, someone who could help her make sense of her loss. Carol, too, found herself drawn deeper into the church. Though her initial goal was to support Linda, she began to find comfort in the services as well. The sisters started attending more regularly, finding a routine in the ritual of prayer and worship. The church became a shared space of healing for them, a place where they could be together, yet alone with their thoughts. Father Marcus took notice of Linda, as he did with all his parishioners. He was known for his ability to connect with people, to sense when someone was in need of guidance. He began to approach Linda after services, offering words of comfort, asking about her well-being. He seemed genuinely concerned, his presence calming and reassuring. For Linda, who had felt so alone in her grief, these interactions were a lifeline. Carol, ever the protective sister, was grateful that someone as respected and wise as Father Marcus was taking an interest in Linda's recovery. She saw it as a sign that they were on the right path, that perhaps God was working through Father Marcus to help her sister heal. The bond between the sisters grew stronger as they navigated this journey together, united in their quest for peace and understanding. However, beneath the surface, something was beginning to shift. As Linda became more involved in the church, her interactions with Father Marcus grew more personal. What started as brief conversations after service turned into longer, more intimate discussions in private. Linda, desperate for guidance, began to confide in him more and more, revealing the deepest parts of her grief, her fears, and her loneliness. Carol noticed the change, but she attributed it to Linda finding solace in her faith. She was happy to see her sister slowly returning to life, the shadows of grief starting to lift. But she couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Something about the way Father Marcus interacted with Linda seemed different, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The church, which had become a place of healing for the sisters, was also becoming the backdrop for something far more complicated and dangerous. Linda's journey into the depths of her soul brought her ever closer to Father Marcus, the man who stood at the pulpit every Sunday, delivering sermons that resonated with the pain and hope of his parishioners, had become much more than a priest to her. He was a beacon of solace, a figure who, in her mind, held the keys to her spiritual and emotional recovery. In the quiet aftermath of Sunday services, while the congregation filed out of the church, Linda would often linger behind. At first, she hesitated to approach Father Marcus directly, unsure if her need for guidance would be seen as a burden. But his eyes, filled with a calm understanding, seemed to invite her to open up. Slowly, she began to confide in him, sharing pieces of her grief, each conversation revealing more of the heavy burden she carried. Father Marcus, ever attentive, listened intently to Linda's confessions. The first time she opened up to him, it was about Daniel, her late husband. Her voice trembled as she recounted the story of their love, their life together, and the deep, all-consuming loss she felt after his death. Marcus's expression was one of deep empathy, his eyes never leaving hers as she poured out her heart. He offered her words of comfort, speaking about the power of faith in overcoming life's greatest trials. His words were like balm to her wounded soul, soothing her in ways she hadn't thought possible. As the weeks passed, these conversations grew longer and more intimate. Linda found herself telling Marcus things she had never told anyone else, not even her sister Carol. She spoke of her darkest thoughts, her fears of being forever lost in her grief, her guilt over still being alive when Daniel was not. She confessed the anger she felt at God, at the world, and even at Daniel for leaving her alone. Marcus listened to all of it, never judging, always offering the kind of wisdom that only someone with years of spiritual practice could provide. The more Linda opened up, the more she felt a connection to Marcus that went beyond that of a parishioner and her priest. There was a warmth in his voice when he spoke to her, a gentleness in his touch when he laid a comforting hand on her shoulder. Father Marcus, for his part, seemed to take a particular interest in Linda's well-being. It wasn't unusual for him to be involved in the lives of his parishioners, but with Linda, it was different. He found himself drawn to her vulnerability, her openness, and the quiet strength she showed in the face of such overwhelming sorrow. One afternoon, after a particularly emotional confession, Marcus suggested that Linda begin attending private sessions with him. He explained that these sessions would allow them to delve deeper into her spiritual journey, away from the distractions of the regular church services. She saw these sessions as an opportunity to finally find the peace she had been searching for. Carol, ever the watchful sister, noticed the change in Linda's routine. She was glad to see Linda taking steps towards healing, but she couldn't help but feel a pang of concern. Linda's increasing dependence on Father Marcus seemed unusual, though she didn't want to question the wisdom of a man so revered by their community. Linda shared this with Carol in a passing conversation, not fully grasping the implications. To her, it seemed like a logical request, a necessary step in her spiritual journey. But to Carol, it felt like the beginning of something dangerous. She knew how vulnerable Linda was, how deeply she yearned for guidance and support after losing Daniel. Carol wanted to trust Father Marcus, as everyone else did, but her instincts told her to be cautious. She decided not to voice her concerns to Linda directly, not wanting to burden her sister with unnecessary worries. Instead, she resolved to keep a closer eye on the situation, just in case. The private sessions took on a new tone. Where once they were purely spiritual, they now began to feel more like personal conversations. Marcus no longer limited their discussions to prayer and scripture. He began to delve into Linda's personal life, asking about her childhood, her marriage, and her relationships. He encouraged her to share her deepest fears and desires, framing it as a way to cleanse her soul. Linda, desperate for someone to talk to, opened up to him completely. With each session, Marcus's demeanor shifted. He became more relaxed, more familiar. He began to sit closer to Linda, his hand often resting on her shoulder or her arm as they spoke. At first, these touches seemed innocuous, comforting even. Linda interpreted them as signs of his empathy and care. But as the weeks passed, these touches grew longer, more deliberate. He would brush a strand of hair from her face, hold her hand a moment too long, or place his hand on the small of her back as they walked to his office. Linda, still reeling from her grief, didn't fully recognize these gestures for what they were. She saw them as acts of kindness from a man who was helping her through the darkest time of her life. Marcus started complimenting her more frequently, telling her how strong and beautiful she was, how much he admired her resilience. These compliments, though seemingly harmless, began to affect Linda. One day, after a particularly emotional session, Marcus suggested that Linda should begin attending confession in the late evening. This was unusual, as confessions typically took place in the mornings or early afternoons. But Marcus explained that the evenings were quieter, the church empty, providing a perfect setting for deep, uninterrupted reflection. He assured Linda that this would help her move forward in her healing journey, allowing her to confront her pain head-on without any distractions. Linda hesitated at first. The request seemed odd. But Marcus was persuasive, and his authority as a priest made it difficult for her to refuse. She agreed to the evening sessions, seeing them as another step towards reclaiming her life from the shadow of grief. Carol, however, was deeply unsettled by this new development. The idea of her sister being alone in the church, with Marcus late at night, didn't sit well with her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong, but without concrete evidence, she didn't know how to express her concerns to Linda. What she would witness that night would shatter the facade of the peaceful, benevolent church they had both relied on, and plunge them into a nightmare they never could have imagined. The evening arrived, casting a quiet, somber hue over the small town. The streets were almost empty, with only a few dim streetlights flickering against the encroaching darkness. Linda prepared for her evening confession with a mix of anticipation and unease. She had dressed simply, in a modest dress and shawl, appropriate for a visit to the church, but she couldn't help the small flutter of nervousness in her stomach. Yet, the unusual timing of this session lingered at the back of her mind. She tried to push the thoughts away, reassuring herself that Marcus was a man of God, a figure of trust who had only ever shown her kindness. Carol, on the other hand, was filled with apprehension. She had made up her mind to follow her sister, not out of distrust for Linda, but because of the gnawing fear that something sinister was at play. As Linda left the house, Carol waited a few moments before quietly slipping out behind her, keeping a safe distance. She felt guilty for spying on her sister, but the strange behavior of Father Marcus and the sudden shift to evening confessions was too alarming to ignore. She prayed she was wrong, that her suspicions were merely the product of an overactive imagination fueled by worry. But something in her heart told her that this night would reveal the truth. Linda arrived at the church and was immediately struck by the emptiness that greeted her. The usual warmth of the place was absent, replaced by an unsettling silence that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The church's interior, dimly lit by a few flickering candles, seemed almost unfamiliar in the darkness. Father Marcus was waiting for her, as he had promised. He stood at the entrance to the private quarters, where he conducted his personal prayers and reflections. Seeing her hesitation, he smiled, a warm, reassuring smile that belied the tension in the air. He beckoned her to follow him, guiding her not to the usual confession booth, but instead to his personal study, a place Linda had never been before. This departure from routine was unexpected, and it heightened the uneasy feeling that had been growing in her chest. But again, she pushed the doubts aside, convincing herself that Marcus knew best. The study was a small, dimly lit room, cluttered with books and religious artifacts. The air was thick with the scent of incense, almost overpowering in the confined space. Marcus motioned for her to sit on a small, worn sofa near the back of the room. He sat opposite her, his eyes fixed on her in a way that made her feel both exposed and vulnerable. He began speaking softly, his voice low and soothing, telling her how proud he was of her progress, how much strength she had shown in her journey. He praised her resilience, her faith, and her beauty, slipping in words of admiration that seemed out of place for a man of his position. As he spoke, Marcus moved closer to Linda, his demeanor shifting from that of a spiritual guide to something far more personal. He reached out to touch her hand, his fingers lingering longer than necessary. Linda tensed, feeling a cold rush of fear and confusion wash over her. This was not the Father Marcus she knew. This was someone else entirely. His eyes, once filled with compassion and understanding, now seemed to hold something darker, something that made Linda's heart race with panic. He began to speak of the burdens she carried, of the loneliness she must feel without her husband, and how hard it must be for her to go through life alone. His words, once comforting, now felt invasive, as if he was prying into the deepest corners of her soul, not to heal but to exploit. He leaned in closer, his hand moving to her shoulder, then to her neck, his touch no longer comforting but possessive. Linda tried to pull away, but he tightened his grip, his tone shifting from soothing to insistent. "You don't have to be alone," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "I'm here for you, Linda. Let me help you, in ways no one else can." Panic surged through Linda as she realized the situation she was in. She tried to stand, to leave, but Marcus blocked her path, his large frame intimidating and unyielding. He was no longer the kind, gentle priest she had confided in, but a man consumed by dark desires, his true nature revealed in the privacy of this room. Linda's mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but every time she moved, he countered her, pushing her back down, his grip becoming more forceful. As the reality of the situation dawned on her, Linda's fear turned to terror. She tried to reason with him, to remind him of his position, his vows, but it was clear that Marcus had crossed a line in his mind long before this moment. He was no longer listening to her. He was lost in his own twisted desires, his hands roaming over her body with increasing aggression. Linda fought back tears, struggling to keep her composure as she realized how dire her situation had become. Just as Marcus leaned in closer, his intentions unmistakable, the door to the study burst open. Carol, breathless and wide-eyed with fear, stood in the doorway, taking in the scene before her with horror. Without thinking, she grabbed a heavy candlestick from a nearby table and struck Marcus across the back of the head with all her might. The force of the blow caused him to stumble, momentarily dazed, giving Linda the chance she needed to break free. But Marcus was not easily deterred. He turned, enraged, and struck Carol across the face, sending her crashing to the floor. The blow was so powerful that it left her stunned, her vision swimming as she struggled to regain her bearings. Linda, now free but terrified, watched in horror as the man she had once trusted as her spiritual guide transformed into a monster before her eyes. He loomed over Carol, a wild, crazed look in his eyes as he muttered about cleansing the marks and tracks of those who opposed him. Linda screamed, desperate for help, but there was no one else in the church. It was just her sister, and this man who had become something unrecognizable. She knew that if she didn't do something, they both might not make it out alive. It seemed as though there was no escape, that this night would end in tragedy for both sisters. But just as Marcus reached out to grab Linda, a loud, sharp sound filled the room, followed by a dull thud. Marcus's eyes widened in shock before he crumpled to the floor once again, this time with blood pouring from a wound at the back of his head. Standing behind him, breathing heavily and holding a heavy, blood-stained figurine, was Darla. Her face was pale, her hands shaking, as she looked down at the man she had once loved, now lying motionless on the floor. Linda and Carol stared at her in shock, the gravity of what had just happened slowly sinking in. Darla, this wife, had saved them. Darla was the first to move, dropping the blood-stained figurine from her trembling hands. It clattered to the floor with a loud clang, echoing off the stone walls. She stared down at Marcus's lifeless form, her expression one of shock mixed with a strange, hollow relief. The man who had tormented her for years was finally gone, but the means by which it happened left her reeling. She knew she had saved the two sisters, but the weight of taking a life, even that of a monster, was something she had never imagined she would bear. Darla had always been a quiet observer in her own home, a woman who knew more than she ever let on. Over the years, she had learned to read between the lines of Marcus's words, to decipher the hidden meanings behind his carefully crafted persona. At home, Marcus often peed himself and beat Darla. Marcus's authority in society was impeccable, and after every threat from Darla that she would divorce him, he put pressure on him to destroy her. He will do this so that everyone will think she is cheating on him, stealing, and no one will accept her anymore. To the outside world, Marcus was a revered priest, a man of God who guided his flock with wisdom and compassion. But Darla knew the truth that lay beneath the surface. She had lived with it for years, enduring the dark side of a man who was anything but holy. It was not uncommon for Marcus to speak of his parishioners in passing, his tone always laced with a subtle undercurrent of something darker. He would often mention the women who came to him for guidance, commenting on their beauty or their vulnerability in ways that made Darla's skin crawl. She had heard him talk about many women over the years, but there was something different when he spoke of the two sisters, Linda and Carol. "They're good girls," Marcus had said one evening, his voice dripping with false sincerity as he poured himself a glass of whiskey. "Beautiful, too. They come to me often, seeking comfort, seeking answers. Linda, especially. She's been through so much, losing her husband in the war. She's vulnerable, easy to guide." Then she realized that it couldn't be left like this. "And that evening I decided to follow my husband in order to catch him in the act and finally divorce the tyrant." As the investigation unfolded, the police began to uncover the dark and twisted reality that had been lurking beneath the surface of Father Marcus's seemingly pious life. The image of a revered priest, respected and loved by his parishioners, quickly began to crumble as testimonies and evidence revealed the true nature of the man behind the clerical collar. During the interviews, Darla's story emerged as a chilling account of life with a domestic tyrant. She spoke in a quiet, subdued voice, as though each word carried the weight of years of suffering. Father Marcus had not been the loving, gentle husband that the community believed him to be. Behind closed doors, he was a man consumed by control and power, traits that he masked with his public persona of kindness and wisdom. As more details of Marcus's behavior came to light, the picture of a man who had been living a double life became unmistakably clear. Interviews with other parishioners revealed that while Marcus had always presented himself as a kind and understanding priest, there were moments when his temper and controlling nature slipped through the cracks. Some remembered instances where he seemed unusually harsh or domineering, though they had dismissed it as the stress of his responsibilities. Now, in light of the investigation, those moments took on a much darker significance. The court proceedings were swift but thorough. The evidence against Marcus was overwhelming. Testimonies from Darla, along with the statements from Linda and Carol, painted a picture of a man who had used his authority and position to manipulate, abuse, and terrorize those closest to him. It was clear that Darla's actions on that fateful night were born out of years of suffering and a desperate need to protect herself and the two sisters from further harm. During the interviews, Darla's story emerged as a chilling account of life with a domestic tyrant. She spoke in a quiet, subdued voice, as though each word carried the weight of years of suffering. Father Marcus had not been the loving, gentle husband that the community believed him to be. Behind closed doors, he was a man consumed by control and power, traits that he masked with his public persona of kindness and wisdom. Darla recounted the countless instances of abuse she had endured over the years. Marcus had been a master of manipulation, using his position in the church to exert control over her life. He bullied her relentlessly, his words and actions designed to break her spirit and keep her subjugated. He would often berate her for the smallest of perceived infractions, his temper flaring without warning. And when words were not enough, Marcus would resort to physical violence, striking her when he felt his authority was threatened. But the abuse did not end there. Marcus was a man who thrived on fear, and he used it to keep Darla in line. He would frequently threaten her, making it clear that if she ever dared to speak out or tell anyone about what he did to her, he would ruin her life. With his influence in the church and the respect he commanded in the community, Marcus was confident that he could destroy Darla's reputation, leaving her isolated and powerless. It was this constant threat, coupled with the fear of physical harm, that kept Darla silent for so many years. The court ultimately ruled that the actions of Darla, Linda, and Carol were in self-defense. They had been pushed to the brink by a man who had wielded his power with cruel precision, and on that night, they had acted in a way that any reasonable person would, given the circumstances. The judge acknowledged the years of abuse Darla had endured and recognized that her actions, though tragic, were a result of the trauma and fear instilled in her by her late husband. However, the court also noted that the act of taking a life, even in self-defense, carried a heavy burden. As such, Darla was sentenced to 3 months of probation. During this time, she was required to undergo therapy to address the years of abuse she had suffered and to help her heal from the trauma that had defined much of her life. She was also obligated to regularly report on her mental and emotional condition, ensuring that she received the support and care she needed. So, now the sisters are doing well. Carol, who suffered a broken jaw and a concussion, is doing well. Linda, who received double pain, is undergoing drug psychotherapy and is trying to come to her senses. And Darla's wife was finally freed from the oppression of the tyrant and hypocrite. She regrets that it happened this way. She never wanted to take the life of anyone, even her tyrant husband. However, that night she saved 2 young and pure souls, and saved herself. Now they are good friends and looking forward.